Noam Chomsky, you were just talking about the significance of what's happening in the Middle East, and you were bringing it back to President Dwight Eisenhower.
Well, in 1958, Eisenhower, this is in internal discussions, it's declassified, Eisenhower expressed his concern for what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not by the governments, but by the people. Remember, 1958, this was a rather striking moment. Just 2 years before, Eisenhower had intervened forcefully to compel Israel, Britain, and France to withdraw from their invasion of Egyptian territory. And you would have expected enormous enthusiasm and support for the United States at that moment. And there was briefly, but it didn't last because policies returned to the norm. So when he was speaking 2 years later, there was, as he said, a campaign of hatred against us. And he was naturally concerned. Why? Well, the National Security Council, the highest planning body, had, in fact, just come out with a report on exactly this issue. They concluded that, yes, indeed, there's a campaign of hatred. They said there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and brutal dictators and blocks democracy and development, and does so because we're interested in, we're concerned to control their energy resources.
Noam, I wanted to go for a minute to that famous address of the general of the Republican president, of the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
My fellow Americans, this evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
That was President Dwight D. Eisenhower in his farewell address in 1961. Special thanks to Eugene Jarecki and his film Why We Fight that brought it to us in the 21st century. Noam Chomsky with us on the phone from his home near Boston. Noam, continue with the significance of what Eisenhower was saying and what the times were there and what they have to teach us today about this Middle East uprising.
Yeah, the military-industrial complex speech, the famous one, was after what I've just been talking about. That was as he was leaving office, and an important speech. Of course, needless to say, the situation he described not only persists, but indeed has amplified. It should be mentioned that there's another element to the military-industrial complex issue, which he didn't bring up. At that time, in the 1950s, as he certainly knew, the Pentagon was funding what became a lot of Pentagon funding was going into creating what became the next phase of the high-tech economy. At that time, computers, microelectronics, shortly after the Internet, much of this developed through Pentagon funding, procurement, other mechanisms. So it was a kind of a cover for shifting, for a basic theme of contemporary economic development. That is, the public pays the costs and takes the risks, and eventual profit is privatized, in the case of computers and the Internet after decades. So that's another aspect of the military-industrial complex, which it's worth keeping in mind. But Eisenhower was speaking particularly about the military aspect, what's called defense, though in fact it's mostly aggression, intervention, subversion. Doesn't defend the country, harms it most of the time. But that's separate from the, not of course unrelated, but distinct from the Middle East problem. There, what Eisenhower and the National Security Council were describing is a persistent pattern. They were describing it in 1950. I'll repeat the basic conclusion. The United States does support brutal and harsh dictatorships, blocks democracy and development. The goal is to maintain control over the incomparable energy resources of the region. Incidentally, not to use them. The U.S., one of the things that Eisenhower was doing at exactly the same time was pursuing a program to exhaust U.S. energy reserves rather than using much cheaper Middle East energy for the benefit of Texas oil producers. That's a program that went on from the late 50s for about 15 years. So at the time, it was not a matter of importing oil from Saudi Arabia, but just ensuring the maintenance of control over the world's major energy resources. And that, as the National Security Council concluded correctly, was leading to the campaign of hatred against us, the support for dictators, for repression, for violence, and the blocking of democracy and development. Now, that was 1950s, and those words could be written today. You take a look at what's happening in the Middle East today. There's a campaign of hatred against the United States and Tunisia, against France, against Britain, for supporting brutal, harsh dictators, repressive, vicious, imposing poverty and suffering in the midst of great wealth, blocking democracy and development, and doing so because of the primary goal, which remains to maintain control over the energy resources of the region. What the National Security Council wrote in 1958 could be restated today in almost the same words.